김자홍 김자홍
야, 그만! 빨리 와, 여기!
귀인이에요! 귀인이에요, 귀인!
반갑습니다.
전 귀인이 아닙니다. 난 아저씨 직업 선택이 신의 한 수였다고 봐.
저희의 48번째 귀인이 되어주세요. 부탁드립니다.
돈 때문이었습니다.
잘못된 신을 섬긴 놈이다.
정의로운 망자라면서.
주광장님, 업경을 한번 봐주실 간청도입니다.
지옥기가 왜 나와?
시간까지 빨라지고 있어요.
죄송합니다.
차사들은 잘 들어라. 원기가 소멸되지 않는 한 김자홍의 재판은 계속해서 위험에 처할 수밖에 없다.
지금 저승법을 어기는 겁니까?
넌 내 명령을 어기고 있는 거고. 차사는 이승의 일에 개입할 수 없다.
살려주시죠! 당신들은 해줄 수 있잖아요!
안돼, 안돼, 안 된다고.
염라대왕을 만나러 왔다. 고개 드세요, 김자홍 씨. 당신 아직 죄인 아닙니다.
Okay, good afternoon to all of you. It's a rainy afternoon here in Manila. Welcome to the UP-KRC Public Lecture. This is an online event organized by the University of the Philippines Korea Research Center. I am Raisa Limampao from the Department of Political Science in UP, and I will be the moderator for today's event. We are delighted to welcome our participants who are joining us in the safety of their homes through the UPKRC's YouTube channel. So before we begin our program, we would like to remind our audience on some house rules. You may send questions and comments throughout the lecture and discussions in the YouTube chat room. So the questions will then be collected and answered by our speaker during the open forum. Just to remind everybody, this is an interactive lecture, so encourage our viewers to please share their comments at any time. Okay, so at this point, allow me to provide a brief introduction or background on the organizer of today's program. So the UP Korea Research Center was launched in April 2016 to provide Filipino scholars and researchers with opportunities to widen their interest in Korean studies. So the center conducts various academic and cultural activities for scholars and professionals and serves as a university hub that promotes and develops Korean studies in the Philippines. And so for more information and updates, we encourage everyone to please check the UPKRC and their Facebook page. It's www.facebook.com/UPKRC. So this afternoon, we are privileged to have our distinguished speaker join us all the way from Denmark. She's an assistant professor in Korean studies at the University of Copenhagen. She has a bachelor's degree in Japanese studies and classical Chinese from the Heidelberg, and a master's in Confucian studies from the Sungkyunkwan University, and a PhD in Korean literature from Bochum. Her main research interests are the circulation, translation, and adaptation of literary narratives in Korea, Japan, and China. So at present, she is working on her first book in which she experiments with digital tools to visualize and create story universes like The Journey to the West. Her articles have appeared in journals such as Acta Koreana, Journal of Japanese and Korean Cinema, and International Journal of Communication. So to deliver her presentation entitled Between Satire and Nationalism, the Transcoded Pantheon of Hell in the Webtoon Hamkke, or Along with the Gods, 2010 to 2012, let us welcome Dr. Barbara Wall. So Dr. Wall, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. And whenever you're ready, Dr. Wall.
Thank you so much for introducing me, and it's a great pleasure and an honor to have the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you so much to the UP Korean Research Center for organizing this. It's my first time on StreamYard, so I hope we can manage. So thank you so much for joining today. I would like to start with a fun fact about brain activity and online lectures. But we will also start with a PowerPoint right away. But just before we start, what I've learned about brain activity is, what do you think when you compare the brain activity while you are sleeping to the brain activity while you are listening to a lecture? What do you think? When is the brain activity higher? Please use the chat to. What do you think? Is your brain activity higher when you sleep, or is the brain activity higher when you're listening to a lecture? You can just use the chat, and whatever, just what you guess. Exactly. Just Sabrina. Good. So I can see. Yeah. So you're right. Just Sabrina. Your brain activity is higher when you sleep. And I think this is something we as teachers, but also everybody who has to give presentations, have to keep in mind that the audience, we need to raise the brain activity somehow. So I try to do this today as interactive as possible. I gave this talk several times, and every time it's a bit different because I like to talk, to have some communication also with the audience. So please feel free to use the chat, and I will also check it. And I like to be interrupted. So we will, when you have questions or if anything is unclear, just write something in the chat and I will check it. I can see the chat here while presenting. So let's start with the talk. Before we really zoom in on the Webtoon, I would like to start with some comments on hell in general. So next slide, please. What do you see here? What do you think? What can you see here on this slide? What is it? It's fire, exactly. And the form of the fire, what is the form? You see war. Kevin sees war. Mountains, you see mountains. So it's actually, the form is the form of the Korean peninsula. And the fire here symbolizes, exactly, map of Korea, right? And the fire symbolizes, symbolizes the complete Korea, yeah, exactly. So it symbolizes Korea as hell. So very often we compare, back to sun erupting, yeah, very good. So very often we compare fire to hell or hell to fire, right? Exactly, just Sabrina, you are right. It's Hell Chosŏn. And I guess you are all, you might have heard about it, that in order to criticize the situation in Korean society, especially from within. So it started in Korea. Korea is often compared to hell, like Hell Chosŏn. And do you also know, so hell is clear, right? What is Chosŏn? Have you heard about Chosŏn? Why is it not Hell Korea? Why is it Hell Chosŏn? Have you heard about Chosŏn? Tricky question. Chosŏn is Chosŏn dynasty, exactly. That's the last dynasty, the last Korean dynasty that ended in, people don't agree when it ended, but very often it's said that it ended with 1910 when Korea became a Japanese colony. And it started already around 1400. So we have a very long dynasty, more than 500 years. And very often when people talk about Chosŏn, so the last Chosŏn dynasty, it has a negative connotation. So people were not equal, many people were oppressed and so on. So that's the reason why when people compare Korea to hell, to criticize it, they often use not Hell Korea, but Hell Chosŏn to emphasize, yeah, exactly, that's sarcasm. It's, yeah. So, and very often, I guess, I also think about English or German, for example, we have, it's kind of a habit. It's not uniquely Korean to compare something unpleasant to hell. You also have it in in English, for example, when you say something is hellish, right? I'm not sure in the Philippines. Can you think about an example where do you also compare unpleasant situations to hell? Can you say, oh, this week was hellish if you were like very busy, for example, or if something was terrible, can you say, oh, this was hellish? Do you do that? Yes. Great. Yeah. So next slide, please. So this is another example. And I would like to draw your attention to the relativity when we talk about hell. Because what can be hell for some can be Wicked universe. What can be hell for some can be paradise for others, right? Have you been, I'm just curious also who you are. are you all in the Philippines? So is everybody who's listening, are you all in the Philippines? Or perhaps you can write your country, the country where you are, in the chat. So just that I can get an idea where you are. Okay, so I guess most of you are from the Philippines. And if you can also leave it. Is there anybody not from the Philippines? I mean, I'm very happy because I'm very, very curious. I don't know a lot about the Philippines. So I'm very curious about what you are thinking. So this is one example that shows you how relative it often is when we compare something to hell. So for what can be hell for some can be paradise for others, right? So from Croatia, oh wow. What do you see? What can you see? There are 3 images, right? On this slide. What are can you see? And they are, I guess some of you can read Korean. What do you see? What do you see on these images? Is there anything you have seen before? I guess everybody, some of you might be K-drama fans, right? And in K-dramas, I think, especially recently, you can very often find the image you can see here in the middle. Yeah, rooftop room, exactly. Parasite, yeah, you think about the basement, exactly. Could you push once, not the next slide, but one, yeah, exactly. So in the first picture, you can see the basement. And then press again, please. In the second image, you have the rooftop. Yeah, Cassandra, you are totally perfect. You're right. Koshiwan. So it's all kinds of ways how people live, or where people live, places where people live. And what is common for all of them is that they all have only one room. So here in the first image, we have the basement, like one room in the basement. In the second image, it's rooftop, and then like one room on the rooftop. And in the third image, we have Koshiwan, which is supposed to be a room for students who prepare for exams. So quite very small, one room, and it was supposed to be temporary, but since it is so cheap and many people cannot afford more, there are many people who live there for a very long time, so it's not temporary anymore. And then, so this is when you, in Korean, when you read these 3 terms, basement would be chi hapang, rooftop would be ok tapang, and Koshiwan would be, so in Koshiwan, the last one would be Koshiwan. And then if you take the first syllables of each, the first syllable of each word, it becomes ji, ok, ko. And ji, ok, what does ji, ok mean in Korean? Ji, ok. Have you heard about ji, ok? Hell, exactly, Cassandra, you're right. Jiok means hell, and ko means suffering. So here, the person who produced this image wanted to show that the living conditions are so bad that they are hellish, right? They are living conditions as in hell. And then he used especially these people who have, or the places where you have to only like one very small room to live in. He or she compared it to hell. Yeah, exactly. So, but then again, I did this presentation before, and then I also showed the same slide. And then there was one student who said, "Oh, rooftop. She always wanted to live in a rooftop place, a rooftop, yeah." And so it's, and at that time, and I also remember when I was a student, I also was a student in Korea, I lived in a basement, and I was very happy to be in a basement just to have a place to live, right? So for me, that was one of the happiest times ever. And I never thought, okay, I live in hell, but from the perspective of others, it might have looked like hell, right? So this is something I think we can, has anybody ever lived in a rooftop room? For example, I think, especially in K-drama, do you like K-dramas? In many K-dramas now, we can see that there is a romanticizing of rooftops. So people are sitting there. They only have one room, but you can see, you have an overview of Seoul, and then, yeah. So this is just an example that to show you that when we call something hell, of course, it can be sarcastic. It's very hot in summer to live on in a rooftop room. So this is just an example to show you that what can be hell for some can be paradise for others, right? So we have to be a bit careful also when we talk about Hell Chosŏn, because if we use this term, then it means, okay, we want to criticize, but I mean, there's probably not one society that we cannot call hell in some way, right? The next one, please. Exactly. So, but it is, so we just said that also in English we can compare unpleasant situations to hell. But what is kind of special in the Korean case, there is a whole discourse. So and this discourse, the Hell Chosŏn discourse, could you press again? Yeah. The Hell Chosŏn discourse. So people comparing the conditions in South Korean society to hell, and I call this the Hell Chosŏn discourse. So, and this discourse started with this newspaper article. Please press again. And it was this title, the newspaper article was titled, "If you are born in Hell Chosŏn, you need to exert yourself vigorously." And then press again, please. And this article is from 2015. So from 2015, people started to use this newspaper article, coined the term Hell Chosŏn. So it started from this newspaper article in 2015. Please, the next slide, please. And then, so now we are approaching the Webtoon. The Webtoon, this is the Webtoon Shinwa Hamkke. And it was already published in 2010. And what we see here in the Webtoon, it also criticizes, or it's a satire of Korean society, but also Chu Homin, who is the author, he also compares Korean society to hell. So in some way, we can understand his Webtoon as or Chu Homin as a pioneer for the Hell Chosŏn discourse, although he doesn't use the word Hell Chosŏn that started in 2015, we can understand him as a pioneer of the Hell Chosån discourse. The next slide, please. By the way, who has seen the film Along with the Gods? Have you seen? So you can perhaps just put a smiley in the chat if you have seen the film. Both 1 and 2, yeah. Yeah, I like smileys. I like the reactions. So what I'm not, I will focus on the Webtoon, not so much on the film. And I think it has also some differences, but of course, I mean, the storyline has many parallels, right? So what I want you to do during this talk is I would like you to be able to enjoy the satire of the Webtoon. Then in a second step, I would like to draw your attention to the nationalistic framing of the Webtoon. And then at the end, I would like also you to appreciate the multiculturality. And I'm not so sure about this one term, multiculturality. Perhaps we could also call it transnationality, on which the Webtoon is based. So my argument is, or what I want to show is that this idea of the 10 kings that play that are the core of the Webtoon, that they are not uniquely Korean, but this is something that many cultures share. But we will go into details later. And I would like also to say that, to explain that my work here is part of a project that is going on in Germany at the Ruhr University Bochum about cultural transmutations in Korea's past and present, transcoding, code switching, and other cultural practices. And there is a special issue that is coming out soon. And also my presentation today, my article is finished. So if you want to know more, then you are more than welcome to read the article. And this might be, I think, so for everybody, most of you will be in Korean studies, or many of you will be in Korean studies. And I think the whole project might be interesting for you also because it discusses what is translation, what is transcoding, and these things. So this might be interesting for you. The next slide, please. Yeah, so this is what we are going to do now. We will start, I will give you a short introduction to the Webtoon Shinhwa Hamkke along with the gods, and also to the story world. I call it story world because I'm trained in literature. The 10 kings of the underworld. So the 10 kings of the underworld is the narrative framework of the Webtoon. Then in the second step, we will zoom in on one section of the Webtoon, the liquid fire hell. So we will travel through to this hell. Then we will take a look at multicultural sources for the story world of the 10 kings. Then we will take a look at the sources that Chu Homin used for his Webtoon. So he gives several interviews, but also there are other articles where he is very precise what was his inspiration for doing this and what kind of sources he used. And then at the end, we will discuss why it is often so difficult to embrace multiculturality. Okay, so let's start. Next slide, please. Shinhwa Hamkke has 3 parts. The other world, Chosŏn, this world, Iseng, and the mythical world, Shinhwa. The Naver, as it first appeared as Webtoon online from 2010 to 2012. And as it's often the case, when Webtoons are, you know probably when, if not, I mean, just check some Webtoons out there. It's amazing how many you can read and how good they are. And the most popular Webtoons, they appear in book form. So as you can see, so the Webtoon appeared 2010, 2012, and then it already was published in book form between 2011 and 12. So very soon, because it was so popular. Please press. So what we will focus on the other world, because we want to talk about hell, right? In times like this, we should focus on hell. Yes, the next slide, please. So we have these 3 parts. We will focus on the other world. And also in this first part, in the other world, it has 2 storylines. And this is the first one. Here you can see a soldier in the left picture above you on the top, the soldier Yoo Sung-yeon. And I'm not sure if you can see it, but he's bleeding because one of his colleagues, he has shot Yoo Sung-yeon by accident. It was not on intention. And then we can see him here bleeding, and nobody really knows. You can see how his colleague, how scared he is, and he doesn't know what to do. So he calls his superior here, and who you can see below. Very scary, and the superior comes, and then he's very angry to see that this accident happened. And instead of helping Yoo Sung-yeon and get him to the hospital, he says, "Oh, he is dying either way, so we will just bury him." And then the superior buries Yoo Sung-yeon alive. And what is tragic about this case is, as you all know, I mean, all men have to go to have to do this military service in South Korea. And it was his last day. So the last day of 3 years or 2 years now, right? The last day. And then, so he is dying and he's buried alive. And the idea behind this is that if people die an unfair death, then they become a ghost. So if everything is fine, I mean, somehow in harmony, then people die and they just go to the other world. If people die, but it's unfair, like the situation is fair or something bad happened, then they cannot go to the spirit, or the ghost cannot leave to the other world, but stays behind as ghost in this world. And this is what happens to Yoo Sung-yeon. So it's very tragic. And then his mother also is, of course, totally devastated because her son is not coming home. And then at the end, messengers from the underworld, from the other world. And this is why I mentioned this, because these messengers play a very important role also in the film, also in the webtoon. They help the ghost of Yoo Sung-yeon to reveal what really happened. So, but this is not the story I want to focus on, but I think also this story is really, really well made. So the whole webtoon is really a masterpiece. Please, next slide, please. So this is how our story starts. What do you see? What can you see on the slide? When you look at it, do you know what happens? Right, a funeral. And just imagine there is like a story that starts with a funeral. I mean, how can you start a story with a funeral? And then, I don't know, can you read? So you have, this is something that you would see at a funeral, like the flowers, and then also the picture of the person who died. And then, is there anybody, can you see what is written there? Is it too small, or can you see it? In the middle, just below, just died in 2009, Maki, yeah, exactly. So 나는 2009년 겨울에 죽었다. Genau. So I died in winter 2009. And this is how the webtoon starts. It's kind of really... The next slide, please. And now so first it's very depressing, right? Many of you wrote, Aigu, what should we do? But then it becomes very funny. So what you can see here now is, what do you think? Who are these two people in black? Who are they? Who are the people in black? Exactly, the guides or the messengers, the Grim Reapers. Sydney, exactly. So that's very interesting. Also, I think in the film, if I remember correctly, they are called the Grim Reapers. But if you look especially at the smaller one, she doesn't look like, she is not grim, right? She doesn't look like a Grim Reaper. So I call them messengers from the other world. And they come to get the ghost of the person who died, right? And here you can see him here. That's the protagonist of the whole webtoon, Kim Ja-hong. So let's just call him Kim. So Kim has died, and now the messengers, Chosung Saja, exactly. So the messengers came to get him. And he's just not getting the situation. And then I was like, what's going on? And they say, okay, are you Kim Ja-hong? Please sign here. Next, please press. And here he says, oh, actually, it's the first time that I die, so I don't really know what's going on. Please, can you explain everything to me? And then here they take him, and then no, you can. It's fine to go to the next slide. So they take him out of this funeral, and then they said, "Okay, let's go together to the other world." And then they take the subway, and you can see that now he's also, because Kim Ja-hoon here on the very last picture, you can see how he's laughing, right? So he takes like the escalator, and then they tell him, "Oh yeah, we are taking the subway to the other world," and he's like, "What?" And you might also know this is, so there are all kinds of references. So all of you who have taken the subway before in South Korea, you know it can be a hellish ride, especially during the rush hours, right? And there is also there are also some people who say, especially when it is rush hour, to call it do you know what the subway is called in Korean? What's the name of subway in Korean? Checking your Korean language skills. What is subway in Korean? Do you know that? You probably, it might be difficult to type in Korean, right? So it's 지하철. 지하철. Lisa, right. 지하철. Very good. And 심yan. Exactly. So sometimes it's just to emphasize how hellish it is. People also call it 지옥철. So the hell train, right? So these are these kinds of references. And then the next slide, please. So here they are waiting for the train, and the idea is that during the times when the normal subway is not running, you can take the subway to hell. Yeah, the next slide, please. No, please press. And here, I'm not sure in Manila, you have a subway, right? Here, it's just like in Copenhagen. I'm in Copenhagen, and the subway was just created, I think, 2 years ago, because it's so small, so people don't really need a subway. But I'm sure in Manila you have a subway, right? And then usually, and also in Seoul, just before the train arrives, you can always hear this announcement: "Please step back. The train is coming. Please step back. It's dangerous," or something. And you can hear it whenever the train is coming in. And so just like the humor, just to give you a taste of the humor in the webtoon, here they say, "So the train is coming, but don't step back. You are dead already, so cannot get worse." So this is kind of the humor that is like that you can find throughout the webtoon. So the next slide, please. Yeah, and here, then here they arrive in the other world. And if you look at the second image on the left, what does it remind you of? When you look at this, what does it look like? So there are people obviously waiting, right? How does it look like? Have you seen this kind of scene before? Yeah, you're right. It looks a bit like a protest, Pamela. Diana, waiting for a person to, exactly. So this is, my first reaction was people waiting at the airport for people who arrive, right? Kunghang, exactly, like the airport. For old people or for people who died, right? Seen at the airport, exactly. So we are now Kim Ja-hoon, our like protagonist who just died. He took the subway and now he arrived in the other world. And then here at the bottom you can see somebody like wearing glasses, and on his card you can see Kim Ja-hoon. So obviously he is the person who waits for Kim Ja-hoon. And this is lawyer. This is a lawyer Jin. So lawyer Jin waits for Kim Ja-hoon, and the idea is that people arrive in the other world, and they have several trials. And in order to go through all these trials, they need the help of a lawyer. So there's a lawyer waiting for him. and Kim Ja-hoong's lawyer is lawyer Jin. And then lawyer Jin takes Kim Ja-hoong with him, and then he explains what's going to happen in the other world. So he says that there will be 49 days of trials in 7 hells. Each of the hells, so each trial has 7 days. And there will 7 trials, so it's 49 days. And during each trial, the judge of each trial is one of the 10 kings in the other world. So there are the 10 kings, and there are 7 trials. And if everything goes well, he doesn't need 10 trials, only 7, and then it becomes 7, 49 days. And now lawyer Jin, he starts to explain this trial to Kim. The next, please press. Yeah, so that's lawyer Jin. And then the next, please. Yeah, so here you can see he has a wallpaper. And then what lawyer Jin really does is, like a seminar, he goes from one hell to the next hell, so one trial to the next trial. So the idea is that there are different kinds of hells, and each hell has one trial, each hell has one judge. And now lawyer Jin, he explains what happens in each trial. Please press again. So, and what is interesting, and I think this is also something that is important for the construction of this nationalistic frame of the Webtoon, is that whenever lawyer Jin explains about one hell, he uses this kind of image. And this is an image from all these images stem from Korean temples. So whenever, perhaps next time you go to Korea, when we can go again to Korea, after Corona, hopefully soon, if you go to temples, you can find almost in all temples, like one building that is where you can find paintings that show the 10 kings, the other world. And what Chu Homin, the author of the Webtoon, does is that he uses these paintings of Korean temples, from Korean temples, here in the Webtoon directly. So you can see these are traditional paintings, right? And then he also says, oh, this is a temple, this is a painting of the 10 kings from this and this temple. Next slide, please. So here you can see he goes from one hell to the next, and you can always see these traditional paintings, and they are all from Korean temples. Next, please. Yeah. And here you can see like a list of all these hells. So it starts sometimes, you already, when you just read the title of the hell, you already feel what you can expect. There's sword mountain hell, liquid fire hell, icy hell, sword tree hell, tongue pulling hell. In tongue pulling hell, as you can probably imagine, you have to, there is a trial about all the sins you have committed with your tongue. And then the more sins you have committed, the more you have to suffer. And people are like, yeah, you can probably imagine it. And then, so each hell has one king. And what is special here in the Webtoon is you can see that there is one queen, right? Yeah, and the idea, normally we have 10 kings, but here the idea in the Webtoon is 7 hells are enough. So if everything goes well after 7 hells, the trials are over. Let me see, yeah, so. And we just to give you like the spoiler, Kim Ja-hoong, he is very successful and he overcomes he has several challenges during the trials, but everything, so at the end he is successful. And then the first part, the otherworld part of Shinwa Hamkke ends with Kim Ja-hoong waiting in front of 6 doors. And these 6 doors symbolize his reincarnation. And it is not clear whether how he is reborn as a human being or as in heaven or so. But later on in the Webtoon, in the other parts of the Webtoon, it becomes pretty clear that he is reborn as a human being. Okay, so that was just the general idea of the webtoon. Let's now focus on one scene. Please, next, please. Yeah, we will focus on the liquid fire hell. And even here, yeah. So I can see your questions, and I will, if I think I have to, if they are helpful now, I will, but I will also remember these questions, because I will talk about what you just asked, Sydney. So we will first focus on the liquid fire hell. Here you can see it looks like a highway in Korea, like a typical one, right? And so they are lawyer Jin and our Kim Hee. They are on the way to the liquid fire hell now. And so in the car, they're driving the car to the liquid fire hell. But in order to arrive there, they first have to cross the river of 3 crossings. And here you can see it also on this card saying Samdocheon. That's the river of 3 crossings. So the next slide, please. And this is something that is also very characteristic for the webtoon. It says that there does exist a bridge of gold and silver over the river. But this bridge can only be passed by people who have not committed any bad deeds. So there is this river of 3 crossings, and you have to cross the river to come to the liquid fire hell. And there is also a bridge, but only people who without any sins can cross this bridge. And then the webtoon also says 그렇기 때문에 없는 다리나 마찬가지예요. So it is as if this bridge doesn't exist, because of course there are no people without any bad, without just like perfectly good people. And then I would like to know what you think. I was very curious when I looked at this image, who is the person on the bridge? And I think in the next slide, could you go on to the next slide? No, oh, that was too fast. I go back again. So when I looked, no, so that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. What do you think when you look at this person on the bridge with the umbrella? What do you think? Who is it? And as you just saw on the next slide, you're thinking about a king. Oh, that's interesting. Any other associations? So I was thinking about, okay, who is there who has an umbrella? And it should be somebody who has no sins, right? Yeah, Lisa, I'm right. That was my thought, like Mary Poppins, right? Because, I mean, Mary Poppins was a nanny and somehow selfless, right? 공자. That's also interesting. 화투. Yeah, I love your associations. You're right. So next slide, please. Yeah, so my first idea, but of course that's because, I mean, yeah, based on my on my little knowledge, I thought, okay, perhaps Mary Poppins with the umbrella. The next slide, please. Yeah, and then also what Koro Taninen Jido. So this is actually, I was just wondering, and it's not so important to understand the webtoon, but still I was thinking, like, who could that be, right? And then when I gave this presentation also there were several Koreans and who were familiar with Ghoststop fans. Do you know Ghoststop? Some of you might know. Koro Tanin Jido는? You will know. So if you haven't heard about Ghoststop, sometimes you can also see it in K-drama. So especially, usually a bit older people are playing cards. And one of the most popular card games is Ghoststop. And they use, for this card game, they use these cards. And then when I gave this presentation before, there was also one person in the audience who said, "Oh, no, that's not Mary Poppins. That's of course here from Ghoststop, from the card game." Yeah, and what does anybody know about the story? And then I thought, okay, but who is this person on the card? Have you heard? But I mean, it can be that there's somebody 걸어다니는 지도, perhaps. Perhaps you know what you can see on the card. I would, because it's a very interesting a story. Like, so on this card, you can see this yellow thing on the bottom is a frog. Yeah, exactly. Ono no michikaze. You're right. So the yellow animal or whatever is a frog, and here the person with the umbrella is Ono no michikaze, and he is a Japanese calligrapher. So the fact is that the cards that are used to play Ghoststop in Korea are also used for card games in Japan. So some of the symbols are Japanese, and the person you can see here on the card is Ono no Michizane, and he was a Japanese calligrapher. And I think perhaps many of us can relate to him because he was always somehow depressed. So because he thought he's never good enough. So Kevin, you were right, Hanafuda cards. So Ono no Michizane, Ono no Michikaze, he thought he is not good enough as a calligrapher. And he said, oh, I don't have enough talent. It will never work out. And then on one day, he went out for a walk. It was raining. And there was a frog. And so this frog, and the frog wanted to jump. You could see, so he observed the frog, and the frog wanted to jump on a tree. But it didn't work out. And then Ono no Michikaze, the calligrapher, he said, oh, the frog is so stupid. It's so obvious. That's not possible, right? And then suddenly there was a wind, and the frog managed to jump on the tree. And then it was kind of like the moment of enlightenment for Ono no Michikaze. He thought, oh, the frog is right. It's all about determination. I shouldn't be depressed. I should just try. So if you are determined enough, then you can do whatever you want. And then his life changed. Yeah, so this is the story, but I'm still don't really know if he is. So I mean, everything is possible. So I was just thinking about how can he be portrayed? Why is he on the bridge, right? So is he really a person without a sin, or perhaps he's a person who makes everything possible? But also the value of the card might also be important. But you can see, so it's not important. Like there might not be one answer, but you can see there are all these kinds of foreign elements also, or elements that do not really fit into the hell portrayal that we can see in the webtoon. So we can, on the one hand, from the wall paintings from the temples, we have a very homogeneous portrayal of the hell world. And then we have these kind of, I would call them foreign elements that do not really fit into the hell world. And this somehow has the effect that the hell world itself seems to be even more homogeneous. But we will talk about this later. Oh, I should also, talking too much. Next slide, please. Yeah, another one, next one. Yeah, and also this k. I wonder why this person says k. Yeah, but the next one, please. Yeah, and then they arrive in, our Kim, so back to the webtoon, Kim, he cannot cross the bridge, of course. So what he has to do, everybody has to do this. They have to rent a boat. So the lawyer Jin and Kim, they have to rent a boat to cross the river. And in order to do this, they have here, you can please press. There is a grandma, you can see grandmother and grandfather. Can you press again, please? Yeah, so you have a grandmother who takes off the clothes, so tal pa, and then you have a grandfather who hangs the clothes on a tree. And they do this because the idea is that the more sins you have committed, the heavier your clothes are. And so if you have very heavy clothes, then you only get a very small boat. if they are too heavy, as you will see in a moment, then you don't get any boat at all. And if they are very light, you get like a very comfortable boat, how you can and in which you can cross the river of 3 crossings. So here we have the grandmother and the grandfather. Next slide, please. Yeah, and here you can see what happens if you have committed too many sins in your life. You will not get a boat from grandmother and grandfather, and you will perhaps just get a swimming ring, and you will never be able to cross the river. Here you can see that Kim and Jin, they got a small boat, and now they are on their way to the next hell, to the liquid fire hell. Next slide, please. Exactly. So this is how the liquid fire hell looks like. Next one, please. Next slide. Yeah. So before they... Back again? Yes, thank you. Before the trial in liquid fire hell starts, here you can see lawyer Jin and Kim. They are having like a discussion what they should prepare. And of course, as you so I mean, this is the humor of the webtoon. It's not Starbucks coffee, it's Hellbucks coffee, right? The next slide, please. So, and this is the trial. Here you can see it really looks like a judge, right? So there is lawyer Jin and Kim, and then we have Chogang Taewang, King Chogang here. And yeah, so it is not very smooth, but at the end, Kim can move on to the next trial. And this is more or less what we see in each what happens in each hell. So there is some preparation, then the trial, and then they move on to the next hell. So it's more or less also very similar to computer games. So you have different, it's kind of a quest. You have to go from level 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7, and then you are reincarnated again. Next slide, please. Yeah, and here again, Diana, right? What you just mentioned. This is a symbol for the liquid fire hell. So it's liquid fire, and the idea is so sinners end up, if the trial doesn't go well, they end up in this liquid fire, like this cauldron, what you just said. So here you can see at the end of each section in the webtoon, you can find like a huge painting, also again from Korean temples, with the symbols that are characteristic for each hell. Very good observation. And you can see that these symbols are also used in the webtoon to connect the traditional paintings to the webtoon. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I would say that if you just read the webtoon, because you have the idea this is because all of the traditional paintings are from Korean temples, you have the idea, oh, this is a very homogeneous, or the Korean way of how hell looks like. But actually, these 10 kings, we are very transnational or multicultural. Already in the 10th century, we have a Chinese sutra, 10 King Sutra. There are different variations of these sutras, of the sutra, and we can find already in the 10th century, we can find the names of all the kings, and but not the name of all the hells. So in the 10th century, we already have all the names of the kings. We can see, and they are used, of course, in very different sources and also in many novels. Sometimes you have slight changes. So, for example, you saw that there is one queen, and in the 10 King Sutra from the 10th century, there is no queen, for example. But, and I think this is really interesting, you remember the grandmother and grandfather, right? They already appear here in the 10 King Sutra. And also the messengers, and they are also portrayed as black in the sutra. So we already this idea or the story world of the 10 kings already circulated, at least in the 10th century. Then the next slide, please. there is also a worship of 10 kings in Japan, in many temples. Next slide, please. Here, yeah, for example, next slide. This is all from Japan, yeah. Next slide. Yeah, and the next one. And then if you are interested in the 10 Kings, there is, I mentioned this in one of the slides before, there's a book by Stephen Tyser on the 10 Kings. And he says how diverse, it's very, very difficult to categorize them and say, okay, they are Korean, or they are Japanese, or they are Chinese. They are just one of these cultural contents, how they would be called in Korea, that many countries and cultures and also religions share. So Stephen Tyser, he says that, for example, the 7/7 rites, that one trial is 7 days, and then we have 7 trials, so 7/7, 49. The 7/7 rites come from Buddhism. Then Stephen Tyser also says King Yama, who is one of the 10 kings. He ruled the land of the dead in the pre-Buddhist mythology of India. And then, for example, King Taesan. Taesan here refers to Mount Tai in China, which is the abode of the dead well before Buddhism came to China. So we cannot even reduce the 10 kings to Buddhism or to any other religion. I just wonder, in the Philippines, is there any... can you relate to the 10 kings? Is there some common, for example, also in fiction, is there some common idea about the other world? Are there stories, or do the 10 kings, have you ever heard about the 10 kings? Because there are, it depends. But for example, when but of course that was in India. Once I gave this talk in India, and then everybody could relate to the 10 kings. But of course, that's not the Philippines, right? That's totally different. And for example, I think people, so if more in Northern Europe, you can relate to the Grim Reapers, right? But the 10 kings is something totally exotic. Next slide, please. Yeah, so let us briefly talk about what, and press again, please. What Chu Homin says about his webtoon. He just says, so what happened with his webtoon is, so he got lots of reaction, was very popular, but some people criticized him because they understood the webtoon in a very religious way, right? And then he said, oh, no. It has no religious message. It's just a story about the traditional gods of Korea, right? So this is what his style, and I think this is totally fine. Then the next one, please. Next slide. Yeah. So he talks a lot about his motivation, and at the end of The Other World, so at the end of the first part of Shinhwa Hamkke of the webtoon, he explains how he decided to write about traditional Korean gods. And then he says something like this: every country has representative traditional contents. And this is something you can, this term is a term you will come across very often, cultural content, which is not really English, right? But, and then in the case of Japan, he says it would be ninja or samurai. For China, it would be martial arts. But there is nothing that pops up in my mind for Korea. So this is what the author of Shinhwa Hamkke says. So obviously what he tries to say is that, so something like uniquely Japanese would be samurai or ninja. And in the same way, he thinks that the 10 kings are uniquely Korean. And we just saw that they are as representative for Japan as they are for China or Korea. So here we can see this kind of, I would say, perhaps an attempt to nationalize what is transnational. Next slide, please. And this goes on. So there are many secondary sources, many articles on the Webtoon itself. And I think while Chu Homin, it's very smooth, and there is kind of, you can feel like this urge of nationalizing the transnational. But in the secondary sources, you can feel like it becomes very strong. And then this kind of othering, so what belongs to us and what belongs to them. So for example, there is a scholar called Kang Mi-sun who wrote about Shinhwa Hamkke, and she says, Shinhwa Hamkke is so popular because it uses Korean myth as sources and not Western myths or religion. So it's kind of defining the others and us. Next slide, please. And then Chu Homin, he also says that, just 1 second, that he used several sources for his Webtoon, and one of the main sources is this, Uri Shinyagi. Could you please press again? Which is the story of our gods. And yeah, so Seo Jong-oh is the author of this book. And he is introduced on the front flap of this book as a former primary school teacher who's now making a living by rewriting old stories. So he calls his book Uri, which is our gods. So obviously the Korean gods, because it's written in Korean and it's addressed to Koreans. And so he has one chapter for the other world, where we find all characters that Chu Homin also uses in his Webtoon. So the 10 kings, the 3 messengers, and also for example, the grandfather and the grandmother. The biggest problem about this book is, however, that he doesn't give, so in this book, he doesn't give any sources. So he never says, he says, I'm not interested in sources. I just want to talk about the story of our gods. So the reader has no idea, if you read this book and also if you read the Webtoon, you have no idea about how transnational the 10 kings actually are. The next slide, please. Seo Jong-oh, he actually mentions that he doesn't give precise sources, the KOCA, please press again. There is KOCA, the Korean Creative Content Agency. This might also be helpful for you. They have a munhwacontents.com. So they have a digital library where you can find Korean contents you can use just as you like. And Seo Jong-oh, he says that he was inspired by this digital library, by KOCA. Please, to the next slide, please. And now I would like you to read this. And just, I'm curious about what you think when you read this. So I will give you some minutes. Perhaps I should say that Uri here refers, whenever he says we in Korean, he uses the term Uri. So I would like to know from you what you think. Do you think, so he's mentioning a container, right? So we need to build a container of our knowledge or our culture in order to be able to accept things from others. First, do you think it's possible to think in these categories, to have a container, to put categories in the container, like container of our knowledge and the container of the knowledge of others? Do you think that's possible? So for example, some of you might have also already been to Korea, right? is this something that you also experienced, that you said, oh, I cannot understand Korea because I don't know enough about my own culture? Yeah, perhaps we can also talk about this a bit later. I think it's very difficult, of course, to think about as cultural knowledge as boxes, and also to categorize or to divide cultures post-colonial sentiment. Yeah, I'm actually last weekend I read this discourse is not uniquely Korean, I would like to say. So there's also this idea. I think very often we start thinking like this in the moment we feel threatened in a way. So, for example, in Germany, but also in Denmark, there is a discussion about what is Germanness or what is Danishness. So coming back, finding back to one identity. So constructing some kind of identity that is somehow feels threatened. And then, defining knowledge or culture is something that is somehow fixed, right? And not having these kind of, not accepting that everything is somehow fluid and connected. And also this idea that you have to learn about your own culture, no matter what this is. I guess even if you are, together in the Philippines, it doesn't mean that, for example, just Sabrina's culture is the same as Lisa Akbing's culture, right? Although you are perhaps even living in the same city. So talking about our culture is very difficult to define, but there is this, you can feel this urge in this to make the moment one's own uniqueness is somehow questioned, there often is this urge to define it again or to construct it. The next slide, please. So what we can find, back to the Webtoon, what we can find here is that, again, these temple paintings, this is somehow how he creates the Koreanness of the 10 kings. The next slide, please. Yeah. And what is interesting is, so here at the bottom of each painting, you can always see the name of the temple. So, for example, here we have Hungcheonsa Siwangdo Bubun. So it's from the temple Hungcheon Temple, and Siwang is the 10 kings. So it's a 10 kings painting from Hungcheon Temple. Next slide, please. Yeah. So, and the next one. Yeah, so he uses these all examples for paintings from Korean temples. The next one. Yeah, next one. Exactly, and then the next one. That should be the last one. Please press again. So just I talked too long. So at the beginning, we started with that what we define as hell is relative. And then the next point, that I think we agree, I hope you agree, that the Webtoon is a satirical masterpiece. We only read very short pieces, very short parts of it. The next one, please. There is a tendency towards a nationalistic frame that gives the impression that the 10 kings are uniquely Korean. The next one. So this is, I think, what actually makes this so attractive to me, is that I think the story world of the 10 kings is a transnational, transtemporal, transreligious treasure box. So it's extremely rich, and you can find it in extreme many stories and novels everywhere. So, and by trying to nationalize it, it loses some of its of being attractive. The next one. Yeah. So this is the last slide. I just wanted to point you again to what inspired what. So we have the webtoon at the end, right? And the webtoon was inspired by this book by Sojong-oh on our gods, our Korean gods. And Sojong-oh, he said that he was inspired by Kokka, by this digital library. And what is extremely, these kind of nationalizing tendencies, we might ask, so why is this dangerous? Or it can be dangerous in this case. I think the webtoon is not problematic. But when it comes to Sojong-oh, it becomes more and more dangerous. He doesn't give sources, right? He doesn't just only said he was inspired by the digital library, by Kokka. And then the problem about Kokka is they have lots of information. So if you go into their website, you can learn a lot about Korean culture. The problem is that they often neither give their sources. And when I searched the people of the other world here in this digital library, I came across images and long texts, and they were so good. And I thought, wow, where do they come from? And then suddenly I found out that they were just copied by from another book, which you can find here. It's a very, very good book on hell paintings in not only in Korea. So this book, which you can see here on the very left, is actually a book that shows how multicultural the story world of the 10 Kings are. And then Kokka, they only select the pieces that they can somehow sell as Korean without giving the source. So it's plagiarism in the worst form, right? So this is something I think we have to take care of, and this can also be dangerous, right? I think that was the last slide, right? Can you push once more? Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry I talked so long, and I think there were some very, very good questions.
Okay, all right, so we're back. Dr. Wall, thank you very much for that very comprehensive and very engaging talk. Before we proceed with the open forum, I'd like to make some comments. Allow me, please. I watched the movie last night. I just watched it last night, and as I was watching it, I thought to myself that I'm actually guilty of some of the hells that was mentioned in the movie. No, I haven't read the webtoon, but I was able to watch the movie. So the issues on filial impiety and indolence, I don't know, but I felt, after watching that, it struck very close to me. All right, so I liked how you presented the multiculturality or the transnationality of the Hell Chosŏn discourse and how it's actually existent across cultures. Korea, the author tries to portray a uniquely Korean identity, but there's always something that would struck or that other cultures can relate to. Another thing is that when you mention about the river and the bridge, I wonder if it's a pessimistic view of the writer on the nature of man, the belief that there is no individual who is capable of doing purely goodness. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if the nature of man, how he perceives the nature of man, or on the contrary, is it a challenge to human beings to be determined in doing constantly good or doing what is constantly right? So does it serve as a motivation for us to be able to cross that bridge or that river? Last point, I think I also wonder what the narrative or the story of the 10 Kings are. I remember in the movie, I'm not sure how closely the webtoon was portrayed in the movie, but in the second part of the movie, Along with the Gods, the Last 49 Days, it showed King Yomra, how he was actually, or how he portrayed, how he himself was the general, and he became King Yomra. I wonder how the narrative or the story of the 10 Kings, their individual narratives, affect how they judge the paragons. So the paragons and how these kings become even more uniquely Korean. So those are just some of the comments that I have. So Dr. Wall, it's up to you if you want to address this now, or you want us to collect the questions before you address all the comments.
I think I think your question. I think it's better just to. I will try to address them now, right away, because some of them is also something that I'm really interested in. So I will start with your last question when you said about King Yonma. So the story world of the 10 Kings, this story world exists already like 1,000 years or so. Yeah. But details are changing. And this is exactly, so you said, how by these individual stories on the kings, this is a way how you can actually nationalize it, right? So, for example, there are shamanic from shamanism. There are shamanic stories that also address the kings, and this is also something that is used in the webtoon. So, in the third part, we find individual stories on individual kings that seem to be very Korean. So, especially when we come to the end, it seems to be very Koreanized. Yeah. And readers will not have any doubt that this is not uniquely Korean by changing exactly those. And I think that's totally fine, because I mean, that's interesting, right? But the story, at the same time, there are variations in other countries too. So in Japan and Korea. And I was surprised. And I also think that the movie is probably the movies are going a little bit into another direction, because the more you nationalize it, the more difficult it might be to receive it in Japan, right? So I think for selling a movie, it's quite, it's so fruitful to have it transnational, right? So I think the webtoon might even be more Koreanized.
I see. Thank you. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Wall. So we encourage the audience to please post your questions. Let's try to make this as interactive as possible. There was a comment earlier from Sydney Bata when he said he was curious if the Chu meant. He was curious what the Chu meant, and if it includes Dokkebi for the Korean content, or does it, or he said,
yeah, exactly.
Verbatimly, okay. Mr. Bata said, curious too if what Chu meant does not include Dokkebi, if he said Korean contents do not have something more unique than ninja or martial arts of Japan and China. So it was a comment from him. So yeah,
I think that's very good. Also, when, for example, when we talk about Dokkebi, I mean, there is also, of course, the K-drama, right? Whether this is whether this is uniquely Korean or not. And of course, you can display it as something specifically Korean or uniquely Korean even. But it depends, right? If ideas of Dokkebi exist all over the world, and it depends on what kind of, I think, elements we want to emphasize. So you can portray it in a very uniquely Korean way, but the general idea of Dokkebi exists also outside of Korea, right? And then,
So you're waiting for questions. I don't think the our audience has become silent. Okay. Dr. Wall, I was wondering, going back to my question on the bridge and the river, do you think it displays how the writer views the nature of man, that no one is capable of crossing? Just interested what your take on that is.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you can, this crossing of but at the same time, when you read the webtoon, it's pure satire. So I think if we think about crossing the river, it's kind of mentions it in a very humorous way. And what you say, it sounds a bit idealistic, I would say. I'm not sure. I still think that Chu Homin is might have. So my feeling when reading the webtoon is not that he really wants to convey any deep philosophical thought.
Yeah.
So I think his main motivation is making his audience laugh.
So it's really satirical.
Yeah, and also it's sarcastic.
Yeah.
So it's more like, oh, there's a river, but of course, I mean, we don't have anybody who's like 100% good. So
yeah. Okay. We have a comment from Sabrina. She says that I think the owning of identity is one of the issues here. While in history, the 10 gods concept is transnational, the author is identifying it as innately Korean. So I think the Korean experience is a transnational experience.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. So I'm still struggling with this because, for example, I also thought about other examples. For example, Santa Claus here in Finnair. Finnair has one ad where they sell Santa Claus as uniquely Finnish. So they say Santa Claus is like the home of Santa Claus is Finland. And of course, I mean, this is also a joke, but it shows, I think it goes into the same direction. So I think we would all agree that the idea of Santa Claus is a transnational idea. So I mean, it's a transnational or multicultural, whatever we want to call it, but it's not. It doesn't belong to one single culture. But we can see, and this is not only uniquely Korean. This attempt to make it to nationalize things, and in the case of the webtoon, but also of Santa Claus, it can be. Yeah, it's a transnational concept, I would say. So you are right, Sabrina. It's a transnational experience, but at the same time, we can feel that there is this urge to nationalize it, and it doesn't seem to be problematic. But for example, there were other cases that were problematic, and I think another example I was thinking about was, for example, Nordic mythology, when the Nazis tried to Germanize Nordic mythology, right? And said, okay, this is uniquely German to define these crazy ideas of race and so on. So it can become very dangerous. I mean, so there are, I think there are different degrees, but I wonder, and I think, I'm not sure whether it's really helpful to why there is this urge to nationalize what is transnational. Why can we not just appreciate that it is transnational, right?
Yeah, very good point. Okay, no further questions from our audience. Okay, so thank you very much to our audience for their very active participation a while ago, and thank you very much, Dr. Wall, for. Oh, we have another one. Sorry, before we close, there's a question here, Dr. Wall. So, did this webtoon stir any critical discussion amongst young Koreans or young foreign readers, and how? She's asking because the story is based on Korean traditional belief or the gods.
Yeah, so what I just mentioned very briefly in the presentation was that it was criticized from not necessarily from young Koreans, but from religious Koreans, also from Christians, for example, who said like, oh my God, why this hell idea that doesn't really fit into the Christian idea of what happens in hell and paradise, right? And then you could see that Chu Homin, he, as I just said, his main aim was to make people laugh. And then he said, my webtoon has no religious message at all. Please remember. So it's kind of no, because he could feel that people were trying to find some religious messages, as we just did with the bridge, for example. Is he somehow, does this have like a philosophical idea or religion? I don't think, and I really believe that he doesn't want to go into these questions. So he just wants to make fun, but with depth. So it doesn't mean that it's not deep, right? It's not superficial. But so you could feel also in the interviews that he was more afraid of people reading too many religious aspects into his webtoon.
Okay. All right. So no further questions. All right. So that concludes our open forum. Again, Dr. Wall, thank you very much. So we hope to see you in future UPKRC events. This was a very interesting and very lively discussion. So before we end, Pam, I'd like to invite everyone to the 7th Philippine Korea Studies Symposium on the 15th and 16th of July. So please tune in to the UPKRC website for more updates. And we hope to see you again in our next lecture next month. So for more updates on UPKRC's future events, you may visit the Facebook page of the UPKRC at www.facebook.com/UPKRC and its YouTube channel. Any last words, Dr. Wall, before we end the talk?
I would just want to thank you again. It was really nice. And also thanks to all the chatters to communicate with me. That helped me a lot.
Yeah. We're very delighted to have you in the program. All right, so thank you very much, everyone. So that concludes our afternoon's session. So thank you, and keep well, everybody. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you.